Yeah, I don't know.
And no one contacted me. Like,
So there was like on the sheriff's office page.
No one would have thought that a person who once sat quietly behind a desk, careful with every figure, would one day be named in a criminal case that shook an entire church community.
and saw my face on a wanted poster, and like, so I called
There
the
was like a
number and said,
$3,000 thing. So
Melissa Ganey English, the former financial secretary of Amelia Baptist Church, was arrested after being accused of embezzling more than $570,000 from a place long seen as a refuge of faith, compassion, and trust. This was no longer a bookkeeping error, and certainly not a record-keeping mistake that could simply be overlooked. When money meant for the church, for the community, and for the good of others is taken away in silence over many years, the story instantly becomes a spiritual wound and a serious criminal case that no one can afford to ignore. What makes this case so heavy is not only the figure of more than $570,000, but the length of time over which it quietly unfolded, from 2019 to 2024, long enough to turn a small crack into a deep void in the life of an entire faith community. This was not just money on paper. It may have been funds meant for ministry, for programs that cared for people, for the day-to-day operation of a church that many families saw as their spiritual home. As that money disappeared year after year, what was taken was not only financial security, but also peace of mind, the trust of the congregation, and the sacred feeling that the place where they placed their faith was still being guarded with decency. And at that point, this case went far beyond the boundaries of financial misconduct, becoming a painful blow to the heart of an entire community. Melissa Ganey English, 44, was not an unfamiliar name in the life of Amelia Baptist Church. For about 11 years, she served as the financial secretary, a position that was not loud, not on the pulpit, not often in front of a crowd, yet very close to the beating heart of the entire community. It was a role tied to records, church funds, bank documents, daily expenses, and the trust that many people quietly placed in her hands. In a church environment where trust often comes before paperwork, a person entrusted with money is not merely doing administrative work, but is also seen as a guardian of honesty for the shared spiritual home. That is why the portrait of Melissa makes this story even more painful. When someone has sat in that role for more than a decade, familiar with every process, every number, and every donation made by the community, the accusations against her do not touch only the law, but also strike the deep sense of shock felt by those who once believed that the holiest place was also the safest place. In a church, the financial department does not simply hold numbers, it carries the quiet pulse of the entire community. It is the place that manages donated funds, operating costs, payroll, credit cards, invoices, and the payments needed to sustain programs that serve people. Every dollar passing through that department often carries the faith of the congregation, of those who quietly give in the hope that the church will be run decently, transparently, and in line with its mission. But for that very reason, when internal controls are loose, when too much access is concentrated in one person, that trust can be turned into a very dangerous shadow. All it takes is one person with access to church funds, bank records, payroll, and spending authority, and losses can unfold quietly, step by step, small enough that no one is alarmed at first, yet lasting long enough that by the time people look back, a crack has already become a major loss. And the most painful part is that what is ultimately diminished is not only money, but the peace of those who once believed that the sanctuary would always be protected by integrity.
What makes people shudder in this case is the way the money was allegedly taken. Not all at once, not in a dramatic display, but quietly flowing out of the church fund through methods that looked almost ordinary in everyday bookkeeping. According to investigators, Melissa Ganey English allegedly embezzled money in several different ways, from unauthorized charges to the use of credit cards for personal purposes to adding extra pay to her own salary.
Nothing happened like one single dramatic act. Instead, it seemed more like a chain of repeated choices, one after another, each small enough to blend into ordinary activity, yet together, large enough to build into a figure that stunned the entire community. And even more painful was the allegation that church money, money that should have been used for shared work, had been funneled into deeply personal spending. From purchases at Amazon and Walmart, to entertainment tickets, concert tickets, baseball tickets, shoes, hotel bookings, airline tickets, Airbnb stays, cruises, and even a helicopter ride over the Grand Canyon. When those expenses are placed beside the money that the community gave in faith and sincerity, what remains is not only outrage, but a deep sorrow, because each alleged transaction seems to have turned trust itself into a personal lifestyle financed by someone else's sacrifice. The truth in cases like this usually does not surface through one loud moment, but begins with very small details, numbers that seem ordinary at first glance, yet feel more unsettling the longer they are examined. In October 2024, 2 new members of the Church Finance Committee, while reviewing records and bank statements, noticed irregularities that had apparently slipped by quietly for years.
The church fund was lower than it should have been. The expenses no longer matched the sense of transparency that a faith community had always trusted. And perhaps from that very moment, the familiar calm began to give way to shock, then worry, then heartbreak. Church leadership then reported the matter to the Nassau County Sheriff's Office. From there, everything was no longer intuition or vague suspicion, but became a process of matching documents, reviewing records, checking statements, and following every financial trace. The deeper the review went, the clearer the picture became, with allegations that the embezzlement was not something that happened in only a few isolated moments, but had stretched across many years. What makes it most painful is that the truth did not expose only financial damage, but also the moment when an entire community was forced to face the pain of realizing that its trust had been tested in a way no one wanted to believe was possible.
Then came the moment when all the doubt, all the quiet turmoil inside the church could no longer remain in internal reviews or on bank statements. When the arrest warrant was issued on March 25th, the story crossed into another boundary, where it was no longer only the private pain of a faith community, but an official matter under the full light of the law.
And after a wanted notice on April 9th, 2025, Melissa Ganey English was arrested and taken into custody, marking the moment when everything that had once remained within the walls of the church became a public criminal case. There is always something deeply painful about moments like that. The sense that nothing can ever go back to the way it was before.
From that point on, a name once associated with a quiet position behind financial records was no longer spoken with familiarity, but with accusations, with an arrest warrant, and with legal proceedings still to come. It was the moment an internal scandal closed, only to open into a much harsher reality, where broken trust had to give way to the judgment of justice, and where an entire community was forced to look directly at a truth it may once have prayed would never happen.
As the case entered the prosecution stage, the story was no longer only the shock of one church, but had become a serious legal file carrying consequences that force anyone to stop and reflect. Melissa Ganey English is currently charged with theft of property valued at more than $100,000, a first-degree felony accusation, showing just how seriously the law views this matter. At the pretrial hearing, she did not appear in court, and her attorney appeared on her behalf. That detail alone creates a cold and distant feeling, as though from this point forward nothing would be spoken through trust or internal explanations any longer, but through records, legal arguments, and the long wait for judgment. The trial has been scheduled for April 2026, with jury selection expected to begin on April 10th, 2026. That means there is still a long legal road ahead, where every document, every statement, and every piece of evidence will be placed under public scrutiny. And for a community that once saw the church as a place of spiritual shelter, this may be the most painful stage of all, because they are waiting not only for the court's decision, but also for some kind of answer to the loss, the shock, and the emotional wound this case has left behind. After everything, what remains heaviest in the story may not only be the money that was lost, but the feeling that something sacred was used in the wrong way. In a church setting, money is never just a material asset. It is also an offering, a sincere act of faith, a desire to contribute a small part toward caring for the community, supporting ministry, and keeping that spiritual home warm and alive.
That is why, when money that should have served people is accused of being diverted into personal life, the pain does not stop at financial loss, but reaches the most vulnerable part of a community: trust itself. Amelia Baptist Church has had to face not only missing funds, but also the hurt, disappointment, and sorrow of people who once believed that the place where they placed their faith would always be protected by uprightness.
And perhaps from this very crisis, the biggest lesson becomes clear, that in any organization built on trust, decency alone is not enough. There must also be clear, transparent, and durable oversight. Because when trust is not protected by responsibility, even a single crack can leave an entire community in pain for a very long time.